Am I live? I am live, good. Hi, my name's Jim Lewis. Welcome to CSIS. Today's event is on the implications of deepfakes. We have a pretty darn good panel, if I say so myself. To my right is Jeanette Manfra, Assistant Director for Cybersecurity, Department of Homeland Security, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is relatively new. And I'll take a second to say you guys have been doing a pretty good job.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I know there's a hint of disbelief in my voice there, but it's actually a good job. So
we'll take what we can.
yeah, no, good work there. To her right is Steve Grobman, the SVP and Chief Technology Officer. Oh, you aren't there. You switched.
Well, he is to the right.
Anyhow, Steve Grobman.
Technically, he's to the
He
right.
said sit anywhere, Jim, so we,
And they took me at my word, which was probably a mistake. Chief Technology Officer at McAfee and a recognized expert on deepfakes. And in between the two of them is Matt Turek, who's the Program Manager at the Information Innovation Office at DARPA, another place that does really good work. So Matt, thank you for coming out today. This is part of a larger, I'm thinking of starting a new CSIS series called Another Bad Day on the Internet. This would be part of it. But I think in the next year, we're going to see a lot of domestic and foreign activity using deepfakes. So I hope one of the things we can do today is talk about how they work, what we might want to do to counter them, what some of the risks are, and help think about what the coming year, which I think will be very busy, will look like for deepfakes. So with that, I'm going to ask the speakers to make opening remarks, then I'll do a few questions, then we'll go to questions from the audience. So with that, Jeanette, since you're the closest one, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start.
Thank you.
So as was mentioned, my name is Jeanette Manfra. I run the Cybersecurity Division within our newest federal agency, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I'm just going to talk a little bit high level on what we do, and in case you don't have any background with us. We have a long legacy, despite being a very new agency, of working with critical infrastructure owners and operators, as well as federal agencies, on a variety of different threats. We're actually born out of the counterterrorism threat in the early days of the department. And as a cyber threat evolved, we continue to put more resources and focus on that. And then Congress, sort of recognizing that last year, almost exactly a year ago, passed a piece of legislation that renamed the legacy sort of pieces of our organization, and then the secretary stood us up as an operational agency. So those are kind of the two big things. We cover a lot of space in our agency. We deal with really any type of hazard that principally affects what we have called critical infrastructure. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about how we've evolved our thinking around that. And then we have a very unique mission when it comes to federal cybersecurity. And so if you think of DoD responsible for protecting DoD networks, CIC for national security systems, and then we work with the 99 other civilian agencies to better protect those systems. So we have a lot of our work, and a lot of the things that I do is really focused on that. Over the past couple of years, we have, like I said, a long history in thinking about critical infrastructure and how do we work with them to get the information they need to be more prepared and ideally prevent attacks from happening, both cyber and physical, but also to build a more resilient sort of infrastructure overall that can withstand things like hurricanes, cyber attacks, variety of things. What we recognized about a year and a half ago, 2 years, when we really started to think about the evolution, was that elections was the one that sort of really taught us this, but it really came from a lot of perspectives on cyber, is that by focusing on what we had been calling critical infrastructure sectors, we were missing some cross-functionality and some dependencies, and we were also not necessarily thinking in the way that our adversaries were thinking. And so try to kind of neatly divide things in industry vertical, or to sort of try to separate different types of threat vectors, cyber, insider, physical. Those were not a useful way to always frame the problem. And so we took sort of lessons learned from elections in particular, but also in some other spaces, and worked with the private sector and came up with something that we call the national critical functions. And so it's the idea that an adversary is really about trying to disrupt or degrade functions in our country, or at least create a perception that they've disrupted or degraded certain functions in our country. And so what are those functions that we need to make sure that we're focused on and we're protecting those? So that set was released in April. It's public. You can review that. And I think it takes a much more risk-based function. It allows us to take a much more risk-based, functional-oriented approach to what we think about we're protecting in this country. And it also allows us to think about the markets and the industry and how things are working, not just how the adversary is working, but how things are connected. Do we understand where the managed service providers are for the financial sector, is an example I like to use. They're sort of a niche set of providers. And when it comes to election, and when you have things like that traditional sort of hacking into a system, but you've also got a disinformation sort of aspect that's using technology, but you're not really hacking into the computer itself, as sort of in the CFAA sense. So how do we kind of bring that holistic sort of perspective together? And that's really what we're focused on right now.
Great. Thank you, Jeanette. Steve, do you want to go next?
Sure. So Steve Grobman, CTO for McAfee. When we think about the problem of deepfake in 2019, it's really about lowering the barrier to entry to building misinformation for the use of information warfare. The ability to have manipulated content being used for misinformation is not new. If you go back in the archives, you can see examples of manipulated images back in World War II in order to make people believe things that weren't actually true. What's really different with the advances in artificial intelligence is you can now build a very compelling deepfake without being an expert in technology or data science. And in some cases, there are actually now websites that are set up where for $12, you can upload a bunch of video and it'll basically kick back to you a deepfake. So when we think about the deepfake problem, it's not so much that we're able to see new types of misinformation content that we've never seen before, but rather it's a different class of user that's able to create that content, which makes the problem much harder. Because now the ability to have massive quantities of misinformation that we need to deal with on all of the modern platforms becomes a big part of the problem. So when we think about what do we do about it, there's a few different key areas that we need to focus on as an industry. One of the biggest is simply education. If you think about still images, if you're emailed or see a still image on Twitter or other social media that doesn't quite look right, your natural instinct is to say, well, that might have been Photoshopped, that might have been manipulated, because we all recognize that the ability to manipulate still images is something that we've seen for literally decades. That same mindset of having a healthy skepticism that if video or audio content doesn't feel just right, to be able to say, what was the source? So this Twitter post said that it came from the AP, but I'm going to actually go to the AP website and see whether it's actually posted there. So educating the public as we move into the election cycle to be skeptical and to see where things actually originated from. And then on the technical side, it is about building out the detection capabilities so that we can win the cat and mouse game against the creation of deepfakes, to give better guidance to the different end users that are using different types of platforms. And that guidance has to be in a language that typical users will understand. Instead of talking in data science terms like true positives or false positives or confidence intervals, being able to say there's a high likelihood that this video has been manipulated, or it's potential that this video or audio has been compromised or altered, and then integrating those capabilities into those platforms. So a lot of the discussion today, I think, will really be about what are the pragmatic things that we can do in the next 6 months to really educate the users of social media, educate our news media organizations, much of which are in the audience today, on what are the right ways to evaluate audio and video for integrity before you make that decision on, I'm going to post this as being legitimate. And then ultimately make sure that we get into our 2020 election cycle where we're able to have confidence in the things that we see.
Great, thank you. Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about your office too? But
sure.
Also, if you could do the what are deepfakes type thing, that would be great.
Sure. So my name is Matt Turek. I'm a program manager at DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So technically, we're part of the Department of Defense in the U.S. Government. We were founded in 1958 in response to Sputnik. And so the goal of the organization is to prevent and sometimes create strategic surprise. And so it was really informed by Sputnik sort of catching the U.S. Government, both from a technical and a strategic standpoint, by surprise. So that's the role of the agency. I work inside the Information Innovation Office. So DARPA has 6 technical offices within it with a number of program managers. An interesting detail about DARPA is that all the program manager jobs are temporary there. So we're essentially on a clock. Usually it's 2 to 5 year term. So that means that we tend to be very focused on trying to get our jobs done. It also means that there's a regular turnover of ideas within the agency. And so I can't take credit for this program. It was started by a previous program manager, Dave Dorman, who had quite a bit of foresight in this area. And so the media forensics program that I run, which is really focused on looking at images and videos and automatically assessing whether they've been manipulated or not. And more specifically, providing a quantitative score of integrity. So that enables us to be able to do, let's say, triage of data at scale. And so that's the primary focus of the program that started in the summer of 2016. We've invested in hundreds of researcher years worth of effort in this area. So the program is a mix of academic and commercial performers, about 2/3 academic institutions and 1/3 commercial. We actually have international universities on the program. We like working with the best people in the world. And so we have a broad range of talent on the program. So I think that's the nutshell on the metaphor program. In terms of what are deepfakes, originally that term was a specific automated manipulation technique for swapping faces in video. And that really came out in Reddit in late 2017. There was a Reddit thread on it, and someone released the source code for doing that. But more generally now, that term has just been broadly adopted to essentially be any automated or semi-automated manipulation technique. Primarily video, but the term in broad use now is starting to apply to other media types as well.
I should mention that we hope to have a deepfake example for you to see to open the thing, but it turns out all of them are either so politically incorrect that we just couldn't find one that wouldn't have created liabilities for the organization. Oh my God. So that tells you something about deepfakes right there. And if we ever find one, we'll put it on the website and you can see it, but it hasn't worked out so far. Let me start with an easy question. How easy are these things to make? I mean, we thought about making our own, by the way. I found a nice Donkey Kong, but how easy are they to make?
So I can start. They're incredibly easy. I gave a keynote at the RSA Security Conference earlier this year, and one of the things that we did as part of that is we deepfaked ourselves. So I essentially created a deepfake video with my co-presenter, where essentially she was the model for what was being said, and then we basically created a fake video of myself using readily available video that's been posted on the web. It took a weekend. So this was in January of 2019. It took about a weekend. There was some technicalities to it. If you fast forward 6 months, now it's literally you go to a website and you pay $12 in Bitcoin and you upload a bunch of video, come back in 4 hours, click download, and you have your deepfake. So the ability for really anybody with zero technical skills to create a deepfake is trivial.
Let me add to that a little bit. So there's no guarantee you're going to get a compelling result out of that. So yes, the techniques are available. They're relatively easy to use. You take your training data. You need to train it for specific faces that you're going to swap. So you train your network. That requires, let's say, a high-end gaming computer to do that, and then similarly requires that computer to produce the video. You might get a video that's compelling out of it. You might not. There's not really knobs that you can turn now to correct stuff. So you could go back in and edit the video, and that might require some skill. I guess the other thing that's worth commenting on is that there's not, at least as far as I've seen as of, let's say, this afternoon, a push-button approach that will do both the audio and video piece of it. So that is certainly coming. But it's difficult to predict with any certainty when we'll see that, but certainly we're on a trajectory for that to happen.
So state actors, definitely yes. As you go down the food chain of hackerdom, where do we draw the line? Are annoying children going to be able to do this, or is it?
I think definitely annoying children. And just to build on that, while the audio and video are separate, I think there are very compelling capabilities in the public domain that do both audio and video. So taking it the final step of stitching the two together is something that, while it might not be something that everybody in the general population can do with a single push button, the barrier has gotten to the point where there are literally hundreds of thousands of individuals with the technical skills to do enough experimentation with finding the input media, learning how to turn the knobs that are available to generate something that is compelling and convincing, at least for general purpose. And I think there are some techniques that can be used that help, such as degrading video. So one of the things that we've seen is a lot of the fake video that has been posted doesn't look the crystal clear high def. It's more of a webcam or cell phone video that has been degraded, and then I think you need to ask yourself, what types of video are you going to actually trust?
Oh, I had a joke and I forgot what it was, so we'll just skip it.
We'll just laugh.
We'll come back to it later because it wasn't that we couldn't find deepfakes to share with you, it's just we couldn't find any that were, I believe the term is NSFW. We couldn't find any that were safe for public display. People know what that means, not safe for work, right? So there's a ton of deep fakes. It's just none of them are ones you'd ever want to show, at least if you were a big think tank, or a medium-sized think tank. Let me start though with turn to Jeanette maybe. And so when you think about this problem, and it's part of a larger problem that you guys face in terms of securing the election, what's the scope of the problem for you? And of course I want you two to jump in as well. Is it politics? Is it crime? Is it trolling? What is it you look at when you think about deepfakes?
Well, I think,
and the whole question of...
Yeah, I mean, it could be any of those things. When it comes to things like disinformation and deepfakes, we're sort of laser focused on the elections sort of aspect of that. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of other cases where deepfakes can be used in ways that would be harmful. So I would say sort of overall, the point about deepfakes sort of applies to kind of all disinformation techniques, and actually even more so when you're just talking about things like, just being able to tweet and sort of have nothing to do with audio or visual. Just the speed and the scale that actors are able to leverage technology to sort of do, centuries-old traditions of trying to misinform their adversaries' public. I think Steve also made the point is where we're really trying to focus is both when the government has information that would be useful to get to social media companies or whomever, how do we make sure they get that information quickly? So that's a really big effort, and the FBI sort of has overall lead on countering foreign influence. Our part of that is sort of building a community of people who have enough trust with the government, and we did this in the 2018 midterms, is where they could submit, say, hey, I think I see something weird here. Can you guys run it to ground? And whether that's an actual government official or somebody working in a social media company, but try to build that sort of relationship where we both have the trust and the agility to be able to respond quickly. And you know, there were definitely cases where it wasn't necessarily a deep fake, but where you had people that were spreading, and oftentimes it wasn't even deliberate misinformation. It was just misinformation that was put out there, and we were able to, by quickly sort of sharing and running it to ground within hours, give it to, you know, that particular Secretary of State or whatever, so that they could put out some guidance and say, hey, I know you all see this on Twitter, but this is, you know, this is not what's really going on. And so we want to build that. And the other thing that Steve mentioned that we think is just as important as the technology solutions, if not more, is sort of building a more resilient public. And you know, there was a time where some of us in this room, I think, remember where, you know, you had some sort of skepticism because you had a sense of the geopolitics and sort of, I understand that the Soviet Union might be trying to sort of take certain actions, and I think we need to make sure that we have a public that's educated, that understands that there are people out there that are going to try to do these things. And so, you know, we think the best sort of solution on this is as much sunlight as possible. When people know about something, just get it out there, whether that's to the specific affected individual, or if it's something that could have broader impacts, just get it out to the public. And so how do we get the public sort of just continue to understand that these sorts of things are going to happen? It's important that I know where my sources are coming from, whether that's a video or a tweet or even in some cases an article. So that's a lot of what we're really focused on in going up into 2020, and we've been working on this. But how do we partner with those who can sort of continue to educate that and to continue to put things out to build that more resilient public? That's a monumental challenge. That's not something that we can do on our own, but we really feel that that's our role to sort of continue to push that conversation so that we can all understand, you know, my family can understand what a deep fake is and how to sort of navigate if they think that they're viewing something that the news community is, you know, we've partnered with news organizations in this space like we've never partnered with others, and so making sure that they know where they can go to for authoritative information, not in a sort of I'm going to write a story necessarily about what DHS says, but we can help them sort of run down facts so that they know where to go for those facts. So that's sort of our approach to this. I think it can work in other cases. Like I said, we're focused on elections, but you could, you know, that can sort of translate into other areas where we see adversaries trying to, you know, create wedges, create divides in our society using these disinformation techniques. And so I think by building that resilience when it's focused on elections, it can translate into other areas as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jim. And I'd say, you know, in general, adversaries are going to use the best technology available to accomplish their goals. So if we think about nation-state actors attempting to manipulate an election, using deepfake video for a misinformation campaign makes a lot of sense. Similarly, if a cyber criminal is able to have a CEO make something that appears to be a compelling statement that they missed earnings or there's a fatal flaw in a product that's going to require a massive recall, you know, putting a video out like that to manipulate a stock price or have other financial crimes, I think we'll see the technology used across a wide range of areas. And we need to focus on the elections because we don't have a lot of time, but we really do need to think about this technology in a much broader context.
One of the things that we've learned a lot, in, you know, fairly hard and public way through elections, but it's actually something that the government had been thinking about for some time, is how is the notion of public confidence, and in how how do you sort of assess either loss of public confidence or how do you get in the middle of somebody trying to degrade public confidence? And but it goes from everything from our financial institutions to even people, thinking that their electricity is down for some like nefarious purposes. There's a lot of ways in which our critical functions are dependent on the public's confidence that they're going to work, and that if they don't work for a moment, we're going to get them back up and running. And it's good that we have that confidence, but it is also, as we've learned, it can be easily manipulated. And so this is, I think, a really big challenge for not just the government, but as a society to really think about, sort of liberal democracies, generally, we depend on the public's confidence in that those things are going to function.
I mean, I think there's a potential for really broad-based impact. I mean, I think we've touched on a number of things, but essentially, if you generalize a bit, these are attacks on knowledge, right? Which underpins everything that we do. It underpins our trust in institutions and organizations. It could be finances, it could be insurance, it could be commerce. It could attack the underpinnings of the scientific process, for instance. So one of the organizations we're actually working with on Metaphor is Health and Human Services, because sometimes there's allegations of scientific fraud. They have a team that needs to investigate that. And so we've actually built tools to help rip apart scientific publications and understand if images have been manipulated in them. So there's really broad-based opportunities for these sorts of manipulation tools. And again, it's not just sort of election and military decisions and politics, but I think they could essentially touch us in our everyday lives.
Yeah, and just one final thing to add, Jim, that I think is a side effect that we need to be aware of is we think a lot about the impact of deepfake being that people will believe information that they shouldn't. I think we'll also have the inverse issue where when there is legitimate evidence that's captured on audio or video in order to implicate somebody in a crime or unethical behavior, it'll be very easy to claim that everything's a deep fake. And given the nuance in coming to a deterministic decision on is something actually real or fake, is going to make it much more difficult to use audio and video in evidentiary areas.
I see, Steve, that you've been talking to those people who claim that the moon landing was staged. They're a lot of fun, but and they have some very credible videos. It's just they're completely false. Mm-hmm. So let's turn to what technologies might be good for detecting deepfakes. Mm-hmm. What would be the good answer? Because I want to bring us around to the idea of what do we as a society need to do. Sure. The truth question is really interesting. The resilient public is really interesting. We'll come back to them. But what are the technological solutions that are out there?
So I think the short answer is the technologies that are good at detecting deepfakes are going to be across the spectrum. So I think we're going to have to use a combination of technologies. Some are going to look for artifacts actually in the imagery or video. So can we detect the differences in image generated by an artificial intelligence algorithm as compared to what would come out of a video capture device like a digital video camera? There's going to be elements that are able to detect anomalies where a generated video will not be able to duplicate all of the things that happen in the natural world. So for example, one of the first techniques used for deepfake detection was to look at blinking. So a lot of the early deepfakes had different blink rates in the deepfake video than what people do naturally. We all blink typically between 2 and 10 seconds. So in these deepfake videos, if you go back a year or two, you'd see people were kind of bug-eyed, where they were just staring very intently. And the deepfakes improved to get around that. But there are other biological things that you can actually detect that as humans watching a video you might not see or might not be obvious, but you can build an algorithm to pick up on those types of artifacts. The other area that is interesting is being able to detect whether somebody in a video is acting like that person. So there are some, you can almost think of it like biometrics acting on the video, where they're looking at, are the head motions similar to the head motions that that particular individual typically has, or are the arm motions, and putting those things together. There's an interesting research paper that used algorithms to encode all of the different actions of head and arms in order to create basically a position on an XY axis for individuals that we all know, political candidates, famous actors, and you'd see that they cluster very nicely given that typically people act in a specific way in the different videos that they're in. And what you'll find is if there's a video with somebody that's an outlier, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's definitely fake, but it's one of the things that can be a good indicator, and I'm sure you can add
Yeah,
on
I mean,
that.
that was a great overview of something that Metaphor paid for. So that was work done by Hani Farid at UC Berkeley, and that's really some cutting edge work on being able to detect deep fakes, and actually even being able to separate individuals from impersonators combined with deep fake techniques. I think one of the really interesting aspects of it is in order to learn those sorts of patterns between muscle movements in the face and head movements, which seem to be characteristic of an individual, requires much more training data, tens of hours worth of data to learn those patterns, which means that an adversary is going to need a similar amount of data in their training process to create a video. So that really raises the bar in terms of the amount of computational cost to create a video, the amount of time required to do that. So that's an example of one of the ways that we can sort of offset an adversary, really raise the bar on them. More broadly across the program, and you already alluded to it, but we've framed the problem sort of formally around digital, physical, and semantic integrity. So digital integrity tends to look at embedded statistical patterns. They may come from a particular device. We can associate images back to the device that acquired them in certain conditions because of small defects in the sensors that are prevalent. And so that's sort of the digital integrity level. We look to see if the laws of physics are violated, physical integrity, things like lighting and shadows, are those consistent? There's geometric constraints that are imposed by a camera when you image a scene. So there's another set of examples. On the semantic integrity side, we look to bring other things that we know are true to bear. So for instance, we can look at an image that was taken outside and estimate weather properties like the temperature and the humidity, and then you can go look those up in a weather database and see if that's consistent with where and when that image was taken. And so we've been investing pretty broadly across these the range of techniques. Part of that is also to put an additional burden on an adversary. The more ways that we can detect manipulation, the more things they have to fool, perhaps the more training data they need, the more compute they need, the more sophisticated algorithms. So that's sort of part of our defensive strategy on the program.
And Jim, I'd say, like, looking forward, I think some of the things that are new to this decade can actually be used as part of our defense. So the fact that every cell phone has a camera, when we look at video, looking at video that was captured from multiple devices, faking the exact same content from different camera angles and getting all the physics and biology correct is an incredibly difficult problem. It's raising the bar to a very different level. So, in the field of something like politics, where if somebody posts a video of a politician making some statements, a very simple thing just right off the bat is, did you actually get multiple copies of that video from different input devices, and are they matching what you see? So using some of these low-tech techniques can be very effective.
Maybe we ought to clarify one thing that I was clear on before we had this discussion. I assumed that the good old Mark I eyeball was no longer effective at detecting deepfakes. Fair statement, overstatement?
I think it depends. So for things like GAN-generated images, there are characteristic artifacts that you can start to look for. So for instance, how the background is blurred doesn't tend to be realistic. You need some expertise to be able to do that. For instance, if you're a photographer, you've got a good sense of what blurred backgrounds look like. And typically GAN-generated images don't get that right. You can see artifacts in the hair. You might see lack of symmetry in things like earrings, for instance. And then on deepfake video, there tends to be more temporal inconsistencies. You can look for things like flashing. Sometimes seams will appear. So I think the eyeball is still effective in a number of cases. Certainly we're headed in a direction where, at some point they'll probably be less likely to be effective.
We had one done to us. It was actually just a picture, not the video, but one of the clues was the person had a green eye and a blue eye, which I guess can happen in nature, but it made us deeply suspicious. Let's talk about DHS for a minute. What do you think the expectations are for DHS in this space? What do people think you'll be doing for them to help prepare for the elections?
And honestly, it goes back to sort of what I talked about before.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of broad, both making sure that if we have intelligence about adversaries sort of targeting certain things or individuals, we'd want to get it to those whether that's a campaign or a social media company, and sort of really working with the FBI on that. And then really it's that broader public messaging. We're not going to be able to know about every single deep fake or any sort of Twitter bot army, but hopefully we'll know about as many as we can and get that information, but also just to sort of help people understand what disinformation looks like, what a deep fake is, working especially with companies who might host some of this information to find ways to clarify for the public, hey, just so you know, this is where this information is coming from. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do. One of the things that we started doing in the 2017, 2018 is working all the way down into the county jurisdictional level, so that everybody understands this is where I go. This is my authoritative source for voting information, or those types of things. If one of our concerns has always been not so much that a bunch of votes will be changed, but that there would be some perception or a lack of confidence because false information was put out about which candidate maybe was ahead, and the final vote would show something different. And so sort of working, it's not just, people aren't necessarily going to go, okay, yep, DHS said it, that's the trusted source, I'm done. We want them to go to, here's your trusted source, whether that's your local election official, and then again, working with the tech companies and news organizations, so that at least we can have sort of, people can understand where that information might be coming from. And again, one of our biggest priorities, if we have intelligence, we got to get it to the people who can stop whatever might be happening.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Jim, and like building on that, I think part of the solution really does come down to educating end users on what they should trust and who they can trust. There's a lot of technology that we understand very well, things like digital signatures, where video that is coming from a reputable source, whether it's a reputable media outlet or a source that is trusted, we can sign it. We can do things as simple as having people go to that entity's website where they use technologies like making sure that they have a good SSL connection, the padlock, or it turning green in their web browser when they look at the video there. So when you get the video from, crazy Aunt Sally, like before you send that to 100 of your favorite friends, like actually make sure that it's something that really came from where they say it came from.
I'll be looking for that one. Jeanette, what does Congress think you need to do about this? Are they thinking about legislation? Do you want more authority?
So on this particular issue, there was a bill that was passed out of the Senate on deepfakes. I think Deepfakes Report Act.
Deepfakes Report Act.
And so the House is considering it, and that's really about sort of studying the problem, which is just it's good to study the problem, and
We're good at that.
and sort of focusing action around that. So I think that's good. It's as you can sort of, even this conversation, there's a lot that's sort of deepfake specific, but then it sort of touches on these broader sort of technologies that are used to manipulate confidence or opinion, and so I think. I don't necessarily know that we need more authorities in order to do it. We've got a lot of really great authorities to partner with industry, and we've leveraged a lot of that along the lines of effort that I talked about earlier. I think more work could definitely, be done on what we're talking about with DARPA, and how do we get some more technology out there? How do we get it to be at a place where most people can use it? I love that you use the green padlock. For some reason, people will trust any video, but they won't trust the green padlock. It's just crazy to me. And so how do we sort of use some of those technology and behavioral stuff that we understand about human behavior, and we understand about how technology can both help drive people towards more secure choices, but also detect when somebody is trying to manipulate that. And it's not something that we see as like being the one to develop that, but we like to help others that can nurture it and get it out into the ecosystem.
Hey, Matt, do you want to tell us what the research agenda is on deepfakes? What do you think when you look at this, or when you see other people in the community looking at this, what's the research agenda?
Well, again, I told you about how we broke down the problem across different types, different levels of integrity. So we're certainly continuing to push ahead in those areas. In particular, we're looking to continue to improve our detection performance, reduce false alarm rates. If you want to do this at something like internet scale, you need really, really small false alarm rates, or you've got the potential of flagging something that was not manipulated as manipulated. And so that's certainly a focus of some of our upcoming research efforts. It's also to really raise the bar on adversaries and potential adversaries. So I use that example of some of Hani Farid's work in terms of requiring additional training data and compute time for an adversary to overcome that. We're really looking to see, how can we offset adversary advantages? Where can we apply leverage to really raise the bar on them? And some of that focus is moving towards more really in-depth understanding of the media, the context around it, where it comes from, why something may have been manipulated, all of that in service to being able to prioritize media for human review and decision making. But I tend to use the analogy around spam filters, right? So you could potentially go through your email yourself and try and filter out spam, but it's useful to have that automated component to be able to prioritize, email for you. I think there's a useful analogy from that to being able to prioritize media that might need a little additional research on an end user's part before they trust it.
I think, Jim, also the level of vetting is going to vary by the entity. So it's reasonable that we want to incorporate detection technology into the audio and video that is presented to all users who are using social media platforms or the internet. That's going to be a different level of detection than a news media outlet needs to use before they run something on the primetime news broadcast to millions of users. So recognizing that while we do need to develop detection technology in general, that the level of sophistication and even the level of sophistication of the operator that is doing the analysis is going to be very different between consumer grade and, for this audience, I'd say media grade. So part of what I really want to make sure part of our investment is educating the large media organizations on how to do good forensic analysis of media and audio that is possibly delivered to them, and to also understand some of the nuance, such as if you detect something as being fake, it's likely fake. If you detect something as not being detected as fake, that doesn't necessarily imply that it's legitimate. And part of the reason for that is if you think about the detection algorithms and detection capabilities, they're largely going to be focused on detecting fakes built with all of the tools that are already in the public domain. So I think we'll actually be very effective at detecting fake app, which is one of the freely downloadable apps for building deep fakes, other high volume deepfake generated content. My worry is if you have a nation state that has significant resources to build not only a higher quality fake, but also invest in the ability to evade some of the detection capabilities that Matt talked about, that'll likely pass because it was actually engineered to evade the different detection technologies. And if the assumption is because we didn't detect it as fake, it's real, that's just the wrong way of thinking about it. And we need to make sure that we're continuing to vet where did the actual source come from? Do we actually trust the source? And do additional analysis beyond the technical vetting tests.
I guess one thing to add on the nation state side, I mean, nation states have had the ability to manipulate media, certainly going back decades, much prior to deepfakes. So, really what these technologies have done is they've enabled doing it more at scale, and they've enabled people with less skill to do it. But certainly nation states have had the ability to manipulate media. If you think about nation state level resources, you could certainly have your own Hollywood. And I think people have an intuitive sense of what a Hollywood could do. So I think nation states have always and will continue to have those sorts of capabilities. I think the other thing worth talking about, we've talked about detection techniques, but there's also another approach, which is essentially securing your media chain and providing authentication at each step. This is not something that we are investing in heavily at DARPA, but there are startup companies working in this space. It's certainly something that we need to look at. So things like watermarking, other secure hashing, things along those lines. I think the challenge for that is that's more of a long-term play. It's going to take a long time for that technology to get out there, for every tool that interacts with media to respect it, for all the devices that collect media to have it. So certainly something that we need to be doing, but that tends to be more of a long-term play in my mind. And I think there will always be these cases where we have things that just didn't go through a secure media chain that we'll have to be able to do analysis for.
Although I read that you might bump into this first, not just in the election, but in product placement. That you're going to see, I forgot what, we had a film we were using an example that you'll see a famous coffee shop's logo in a film from the 1950s or something. So it's something to look forward to, I guess. I've seen some of other countries' deepfakes technology. The Chinese a couple years ago had a bunch of us on stage with their leading rapper. So I've never rapped in Chinese before, but it was kind of fun. So that was indetectable, at least to me. When I was preparing for this, when we were thinking about it and in our background paper, one of the things that struck me is that there were some similarities, and Steve and I have talked about this before, some similarities to the problem of authentication online, authentication of identity, authentication of fact. And Matt, you kind of brought up that we're in a post-truth environment in some ways. That's what people say. I don't know if I believe it, but it's a handy slogan. So where does this fit in? And this is something that all three of you can talk about. How does this fit into the larger problem of authenticating stuff online?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, I think it depends on what you mean by authenticating. I think there's different levels of that. So, did this media come from where it says it came from is one thing. Being able to do things like automated fact checking, I think, is others. Some of the technology you need to do that really means that you need to understand the semantic content and have good, detailed understanding of the media. Not the media in the press, but text, image, video, audio sort of media. And really that's pushing the state of the art in terms of what AI is capable of doing or machine learning is capable of doing. So it's certainly places where we're looking to invest from a DARPA perspective is being able to do more automated reasoning, more automated understanding of media content, again, to provide tools that can help humans make decisions.
I think a big challenge in the authentication, I'd say it's actually not a technology problem. We understand how to do the crypto, how to create the protocols needed for strong authentication, strong identity. I think a big part of the problem, especially in the consumer realm, is education. It's a consumer being able to recognize that just because a Twitter account has the AP logo and is called, therealap.org, like that might not really be the AP. So recognizing how to identify things as simple as verified accounts, on some of the more personal social media platforms, I think it's even harder because you have, all of this digital content of contacts and simply downloading a picture of somebody that really exists and hijacking their account and impersonating them and spreading viral deepfake content is incredibly easy, even if we have all the right underlying protocols.
Jeanette, what are you guys doing on authentication? Is that still a problem for DHS?
Well, I mean, but this is much larger than just deepfakes and disinformation.
Yeah. But it's related, you could make the case.
It's definitely related. I would just say that, probably said it better than I will, that we've worked very hard on working through identity issues for years. We've, sort of been working with NIST on, trusted identities in cyberspace, and there's a lot of sort of I'll say from the U.S. perspective, the idea of how we sort of catalog people's identities, who has access to that identity. That's just sort of way out of my sort of lane, but there's sort of a lot within the U.S. culture itself. If you think about like how many people here have gotten their real ID, and sort of the challenge in getting that, and the notion that we would get to a place where you would have sort of an individual identity-based authentication capability online, it seems like that would, I don't see that happening. I think what, the work we have done is, more in that traditional sort of, OMB has put out a policy, we're putting in place sort of tools to verify, is this the employee, sort of on the network. This isn't about the public internet, but on the network that you're using, is this the employee? Is this the access they're supposed to have? Sort of trying to reduce the problem we have a lot, which is our most common thing is stolen credentials and people having complete access because they had access they shouldn't have had. So that's where we've been focused on identity. Years ago, us in Commerce had the national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace, and there's some money that was given out to kind of think about this problem. But I would sort of, I think there's other sort of more promising work of when you talk about authentication, whether that's of facts or media, than trying to do it from an identity perspective on the public internet. I think there's a lot you can do on your sort of internal networks, but I don't see how we would get there on the public internet.
I have a couple more questions. Actually, I have 4. But before we go to my questions, let's see if there's questions from the audience. Got any? We've got one. We've got a bunch here. We've got a couple in the center. So, if we can get a microphone, and please identify yourself.
Yeah, hi, Ashish Jaman. I work for Microsoft, focus on the issue area of synthetic media deepfakes. One thing that I've seen actually participating in the last many months on deepfakes is the taxonomy is a problem, right? Whenever we talk about deepfakes, we're always talking about the problem area. We're not talking about the good use cases of synthetic media. So just a comment, because there's a lot of good use cases of synthetic media. Yes, that does require characterization, labeling, and whatnot, but we should also focus on the good use cases in many cases. The question I want to ask is around the watermarking, right? Videos. Yes, we have done watermarking and we have done hashing on images, and it's simple, but video is incredibly hard technologically, computationally very expensive to do authentication after all, right? And then it's very easy to break as well. Watermarking on a video is very easy to break. So even though it's a proven technology on image, but it's incredibly hard on video and audio. So how do you take the watermarking authentication idea forward? Because not only technologically, but yes, wanted to hear.
Yeah, I guess I don't know that I've got specific technical approaches to suggest there. I think even if the watermarking is relatively fragile, or particularly for an adversary to overcome, I think it's still useful in the sense that it may indicate that an adversary actually tried to do something. So I guess I will continue to advocate for folks to try and sort of take proactive measures, watermarking, other ways to secure media. I certainly will agree with you that there are positive uses for synthetic media generation. Certainly a lot of it's driven by the entertainment industry, but you can also think about compelling examples where you can provide the voice back to someone who's losing their voice, or because of degenerative diseases, their speech patterns are changing and they would sort of like to be able to do a video hangout with their grandchild and look the way they used to. So there certainly are positive uses for it. I don't think that some of these, watermarking or other proactive security measures actually break those use cases at all. So that's something else to keep in mind.
The one thing I would add is that there is a challenge with the technologies that are about authenticating the videos that we trust, and that is we have to make sure that we safeguard those methods. So for example, if there's a trusted news organization that is now digitally signing videos, if they don't have good security practices and their signing keys are stolen, or somebody can infiltrate their environment and use their environment to sign video that is fake, it now adds tremendous credibility to that fake video. So one of the things that we need to think about as we start building on some of these new trust patterns is how do we make sure that the organizations that ultimately are trusted have strong security practices that allow them to safeguard those.
Did we hit all the good use cases? Did you have any other ones you wanted to throw in? Let's get a microphone. Yeah, go ahead.
At Microsoft, right? Giving voice to the impaired people.
Okay. All right, great. We had another question. We have a couple. How about we get that one, and then we'll go over to this side. Behind you.
Like, right.
Hi, I'm Terry Toland with A.T. Kearney. My question is that when I've seen deepfakes on YouTube or read about them online, they've generally been generated by an individual user or someone who claims to be a hobbyist. Are there examples online have been unleashed by a state actor at this point, or is this just something we're anticipating?
Everyone's looking at you.
I was trying to.
You can take a pass.
I don't think that's something I could really answer right now. I don't think so.
Anyone seen one?
But I mean,
I'm not aware of any validated state actors in the public domain.
Yeah.
So we should be worried about them doing this if they haven't?
Absolutely.
Okay.
yeah, definitely.
All right. Let's get this one, and then we'll go over to the other side. Thank you.
Yeah, Ken Myricourt, retiree. Wow, this is quite a can of worms. The year 1984 keeps coming to mind. You mentioned that any nation state has the capability to produce deep fakes. What if it, and I would have to assume that our government is doing the same that we're worried about the adversaries doing. And unfortunately, if they can aim it at the enemy, but since the internet is global, it could affect Americans. How would you all handle that if you found a deep fake and discovered it goes back to the CIA?
Well, I see they're all going to dodge that one. So let me. Anyone want to take a? If not,
I won't answer the exact question, but I think what I will say is, it does raise an interesting question, which is, could a deep fake that is an act of information warfare against the United States, is that something that would rise to the level that a response to release of a deep fake by another country would be treated the same way that we would respond to a cyber attack? So I think we are already on record as saying, we will look at a cyber attack in the same way that we would look at an attack from a traditional or kinetic attack. Is information warfare going to fall into that same category? And I don't necessarily have the answer, but I do think it's a good question.
I would just sort of clarify one thing. It would be more the consequence that would be sort of how we would think about how to respond to a cyber attack or information warfare. There's a lot of things that you have to consider when you think about how to respond to an adversary using some sort of technology weapon, I guess I would say broadly, against us. I can't really answer the specific question either. I can say that it is something that we think of. I guess what I would say generally, cyber tools, we'll call them that, is as we seek to have that capability to support our national security interests, we are always thinking about that potential for consequences and blowback back. It's sort of thinking about what that blowback might be in the United States and being that advocate for those who maybe aren't in the government, whether those are companies or just our citizens, and thinking through that. So that particular scenario is not necessarily one that is one that we've talked about it, but it would be in that what we do talk a lot about is that that cost benefit of when we decide to take an action against a certain country, and we've been doing this for years. It's stuff we've done in not anything to do with cyber, and thinking about things like intelligence gain loss or operational sort of risk, and how do we balance those things. Cyber has made it more complicated to have that conversation, but that's sort of what our role would be, and I would imagine it would be as sort of a similar scenario as you've described.
And I do think the situation matters. I think we've come to accept that using offensive cyber as a precision munition in order to minimize collateral damage to civilian populations is something that we're supportive of as a nation. Using a deepfake video to pull a terrorist away from a civilian population in order to support an operation, like that seems something in the realm of being reasonable. So I think it is a tool, and exactly how you use it is really what matters.
That's why 1984.
Yeah. I would say we are much more prescribed in how we use our capabilities than other agencies or other nations may be against us.
So from the DARPA perspective, we're not an operational organization, so it's sort of contrary to what's written in books and sometimes in the popular press. We're not out there sneakily surveilling the internet. It's really our job to work with the research community to be forward thinking about some of these long-term strategic threats. Everything that we're doing on the media forensics program is defensive, and all our researchers are publishing our work. So from a strategy standpoint, I actually see it as a significant advantage to the US, both strategically and potentially tactically, if we can take disinformation off the table. And that's part of the reason why we have this very open defensive posture on the program. So that's why I will come and talk about the program while we're publishing research, and you see a lot of mentions in the press and a lot of interactions with researchers that Metaphor is funding. We are being very open about what we're doing on the program.
Okay, I think we had one over there, and then we'll come back to this gentleman, please.
John Santini from the 1st Information Operations Command. And you talked about educating the public. Where do we draw the line between a healthy skepticism and conspiracy? It goes along with what that gentleman said over there. How can we educate the public without the public thinking that the government is doing the nefarious actions you refer to?
Maybe I will.
This is really hard. It's something that we struggle with a lot, I think, in the government, and even I think sometimes companies too, but I would let them speak for themselves, is if you have usually our practice is, as well as I understand what most companies, if you have sort of information that somebody's being targeted or has been targeted, you try to really sort of scope down who has that information out of respect for that victim. You're not trying to sort of run around telling everybody what happened. You want to have that respect for that victim of whatever was happening to them. And we sort of cherish that policy. We're quite passionate about protecting those identities of victims, partly for just out of respect of what they have to deal with, but also partly because we're a voluntary organization and we rely on that trust. When you start to get to somebody was a target and that is potential impacting what a public generally might think about what's going on, that's a complicated thing to balance. My perspective is that I believe that the better answer is usually to get things out as public as possible if you're talking about something that affects some public debate or some public outcome. That's sort of where we try to lean towards is sunshine sort of the best disinfectant. How do you sort of get people to not go towards conspiracy or I have no idea. My own family loves to like throw conspiracies around, and so I don't know how to get there. All I can say is that from what I think our responsibility is if we know things that are going on that affect a public debate or potential public outcome, it's important to get it out to the public. If there's some more narrowly scoped set of individuals that are relevant to that, then let's go ahead and do that. I can't sort of control beyond that.
The only thing I'd add is I think that there's value in educating users to trust some entity that has the ability to perform sophisticated forensics. So whatever news outlet somebody trusts, at least we'll be able to work with legitimate news agencies to train their own people how to vet and analyze things like video and audio. So I don't think that it's necessary for everything to come back to the US government, that there can be multiple parties performing analysis. I think it'll be interesting if we actually see different conclusions. So if news agency A says this is fake and news agency B says it's real, I think that's where actually putting the data in the public domain, where we actually have technologists look at the data to help with the tiebreakers will be key.
I think there's some interesting social science questions there. That's certainly outside of my swim lane, but essentially it comes down to, how do I provide information to people in a way that enables them to sort of make their own decisions and come to, let's say, fact-based conclusions. So I think that's certainly something we need to think about, probably work on research in that area. And I think that's all in service to having sort of a healthy information economy.
This is a longer discussion, so maybe we'll skip it. But I would say that in the past, if there were information operations, how you separate them from a foreign target audience and a domestic audience has always been a crucial point. And the sort of tripwire is Congress will come down on you like a ton of bricks if it looks like you're doing domestic influence. So nobody ever goes near it, right? It's just, you can't imagine how annoyed they get.
To be clear, I'm not aware that there's such a thing as domestic influence operations, nor
There's
would
not.
anybody be authorized to do such a thing.
And if you even thought about it, you would be spending the rest of your life briefing congressional committees or complaining or explaining.
Yeah, and we really have the 1984 situation.
Yeah, I've just never seen it. So, but there's sometimes when you do
There's other countries.
Sometimes when you target a foreign audience, you might have spillover effect, and I think people go out of their way to avoid that.
They absolutely do. Absolutely.
Okay, we had a couple that set them off, didn't it?
Yeah.
How about the one in the front here, and then we'll get all the questions, and then we might have to start grouping them.
John Morgan, DoD. Question for the technology-based portion, specifically for DARPA, sir, if you don't mind. Facebook, Amazon, and I believe a few other services have come together recently for a $10 million deepfake detection. Just wondering, I noticed earlier you'd said that you're publishing all your material. Is there any involvement from DARPA, and will you be publishing that material as well, along with those, or separately to their research?
Sure. So yes, I think there's been a couple investments. So Google recently has put out a deepfake detection data set. And then separately, I believe Facebook and Microsoft went in together also on a deepfake detection data set. So DARPA's not directly involved in that, not directly funding it. I think it's good for the research community. I think having, the state of the art in machine learning is such that the more training data that you have, the more representative of the real world it is, the better results that you'll get. So I'm happy to see that other organizations are investing in this space. In terms of what's being published on the program, all the researchers essentially have the freedom to publish their work. So it's not like we're putting together one binder across the program. It's the normal course of doing research. People are publishing in conferences and journals and things like that. And so that's generally how we're sort of disseminating the technical work. Although all the institutions on the program maintain their own intellectual property rights to what they develop. So they have the ability to commercialize it and to partner with other organizations to do that. So that allows for broad dissemination of it. Within the US government, we have rights to that intellectual property as well, so that I can share it with transition partner organizations.
Okay, we had one over here, and then we've got one in the back. And then we'll start grouping them because we're coming close.
Sam Matheny, CTO of the National Association of Broadcasters. You have already addressed what was going to be the first part of my question, which is really what is the role of the platforms. Jigsaw, part of Alphabet, released the data set, and then there's the deepfake detection challenge that's going on. But at the other end of the spectrum, I mean, they clearly can identify false accounts and have removed them and have said these are being done by nation states. And so I think to the earlier question, it isn't that much of a leap to think that these things are going to happen. But do they have a responsibility to, they being the platforms? They've also, Facebook in particular, said, oh, we know that is fake content. We know that is a doctored video. It's a cheap fake. It's not a deep fake like we're talking about, but we're not going to take it down. Do you think they have a different or higher responsibility when they know there is fake content to have that taken out of the discussion?
I think there's a responsibility to give informational guidance. I think one of the things that is difficult with deepfakes is edited video, altered video? Is manipulated video for parody something that we should ban? I think there are a lot of nuanced questions that make the discussion complex when you start getting into the term, should they ban? What I think they can do is inform. So if there's a video that the algorithm says has a high confidence of being altered, manipulated, fake, having a very clear banner that says, this video is likely altered, this video is likely manipulated. And I think that diffuses a lot of the debate on what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed, because then it's simply stating, based on our best detection algorithms, this is what we are informing you of some additional data for you to then come to your own conclusion.
Okay, I think we had a couple more. Why don't we wrap them up? We've got one here and one here. Can we do them both at the same time? We'll start with this gentleman.
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz. One of the biggest problems with fakes, deep or otherwise, is the fact that they go viral so quickly before anybody can validate them. And I'm wondering if there's, and especially fake news seems to go viral much faster than true news. And I'm wondering, is there some way to hold people responsible for sharing fake news, perhaps by public shaming, to try to convince people not to hit that share button instantly?
We had a really long discussion preparing for this about the First Amendment. And so from the First Amendment perspective, I think the answer is no. But I don't know, maybe...
I mean, I would say not a journalist or something, but there are standards of journalistic integrity and others that I know that our journalists take very seriously. But in the end, our First Amendment is one of the most important things that we have in this country, and I don't think we want to be. Your fake news is not somebody else's fake news these days. And so we have to sort of continue to, I think, have this conversation, sort of the civil society conversation that we're having, and help people, like Steve said, so that they're informed about where did this come from. And we encourage people to, before you hit share, let's make sure that you understand where it came from. I don't think the government should be in the business of public shaming or.
And that gets to the
if
earlier
that's what you
question.
were asking.
It gets to the earlier question. I think it reflects back to your sunshine point. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe the best we can do is be transparent and open, and then you have to let people make up their own minds.
The thing is people have to, we've had to balance in this country, and I know in many other countries, to sort of competing values for generations, and this is another example of where we are having that conversation about those competing values, and security and safety and openness and transparency is something that we've, at least in this business, talked about a lot, and I think it's good that it's generating more public debate about that. But I want us to not overcorrect. And you start sort of infringing on other values that we cherish equally deeply. And that's why I'm sort of pushing for that, just the public awareness, the information, and people in the end have to make their own decisions in democracy.
And I think in the long run, it will self-correct itself. If you look at, in the early days of the internet, text went viral. There was a story of somebody sent out something that looked like a press release about a company, and just the fact that it was formatted as a press release, it went viral, stock prices moved. Now people are very skeptical. If you just get an email, you're not gonna believe it because of its formatting. Similarly, with static images, if there's an image that is something salacious, like we're gonna look at where did it come from. I think over time, the general public's gonna get there with video. I don't know that it's gonna get there in the next 6 months though.
Okay, we had a couple more, and then we'll take them all at the same time. So that one and then over. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I study non-state actors. You emphasize the choice to respond to a consequence of a cyber attack, act of aggression, or a disinformation campaign. Did you want to speak a little bit more on that choice and how it counters conflict escalation, perhaps about the terminology or how to quantify a consequence to create a standard?
I assume that was me. So, did you want to ask a couple of questions, or should I just?
Go ahead and answer
Okay.
it, and then we'll just, we're almost done.
Yeah, so I think for some years, and this has transcended 2 administrations now, the concept of cyber norms, and has been something that we as governments and allies and frankly some that we're not allies with, and the idea of establishing some norms. I think one thing that's important, a lot of people, it's like, oh, it's cyber, it's new, it's different, we have to have all these different things. International law, from at least the United States perspective, and many other countries, still applies, regardless of whether it happens over the internet. And so that's something to sort of think about. All the things that we've sort of built in terms of responding to national security threats or homeland security threats, those are all the same things that we think about when it's a cyber thing. I don't even like using the word attack, because that sort of denotes a sort of some sort of physical effect has happened. There's more work that needs to be done there, but sort of one of the norms is kind of the idea of let's not cyber attack each other's critical infrastructure. Let's sort of have that be a bit out of bounds as a norm of state behavior. So those are the kind of conversations that are being had, whether it's in the UN or G20 or others, that the US at least has been hopeful to continue to push some of those. There's other norms about not sort of using your capabilities to steal IP for your state's advantage, which us and China agreed to. In terms of response, that's sort of, I think, a continuing evolution, but every case is different. And a lot of people want to sort of use a different sort of cyber incident and say, well, this was an attack on our country. Why are we not sending, bombs? we wouldn't, we wouldn't do that in a variety of scenarios. We would have sort of a mature conversation about what's actually going on, and there are other avenues that we communicate with adversaries that are not public, that are not have nothing to do with cyber, to try to in fact try to de-escalate. And so that's always kind of one of my concerns is the escalation of conflict based off of misperceptions or other sort of hard and fast rules that people want to say, oh, a cyber attack means you will do X. And so that's sort of what I would say to that.
Okay, we've got one last question, and then I have one final question for the panel.
Hello, Adam Kaplan with USAID's U.S. Agency for International Development's Office of Transition Initiatives. Work on these issues around the world in many places that are not nearly as norm-respecting as our own country. I'd like to present maybe a bit of a dystopian scenario, but as the arms race continues of ever better fakes and ever better detection and ever better fakes and ever better detection connected with computational propaganda and AI-driven tools to create disinformation, machine-driven. What does this mean for people's ability to negotiate difference, to negotiate a civic space when all information is in fact suspect?
I think it becomes yet another domain where we have this cat and mouse game. I think we have that today in cybersecurity. The attacks get more sophisticated. We get better cyber defense capabilities. If you look at the defense space, it's the exact same thing. You have stealth capabilities, you have better stealth detection capabilities. I think information warfare is now moving into become one of those domains, and just recognizing that there will be this race of detection and better creation of fictitious content, and making sure that when it really matters that we use the best possible capabilities to vet content along with educating the public. I think all of that put together puts us in a place where it's not dystopian.
Yeah, I think there are technical approaches that can help. I mean, none of these problems are, a silver bullet technical solution is going to solve these. So I just want to be clear about that. But things like that provenance and securing your information chain that we talked about being a long-term strategy, I think that's one of the reasons why that's important to invest in, because that's a technology where, okay, maybe there's a large amount of disinformation out there. Here's some nuggets that have been secured, and then I have confidence in those. And particularly if you're talking about negotiating across governments and things like that, then I think there are technical means that you can use to sort of secure that sort of information to have those conversations happen in a trusted way.
I would say I don't necessarily have a dystopian perspective out, but I'm generally optimistic about most things. I think that sort of deepfakes being one symptom of this, but we are definitely on the verge. A lot of people call it the fourth industrial revolution or whatever. There's a lot of things that are changing. Is sort of that technology has enabled. Is it a change in kind or just a change in scale when you're talking about information operations? I mean, countries have been manipulating news for decades. We've just made it so we can do it faster and reach more people. So does that fundamentally change sort of like what you said about how you engage in civic society? I'm not sure I'm convinced that it fundamentally changes. I think it sort of raises the level of urgency and the importance of having technologies that can counteract it, having public debates about it, having the platform providers and others providing that information. I'm not yet convinced that this is sort of some fundamental shift in the underpinnings of our sort of societies just yet. Maybe when my son is older, he can figure it out.
Okay, final question, and you can be quick or long on this one. What advice would you give to the electoral campaigns? What advice would you give to voters? So if you were going to say to people, because this will be on the internet forever, what's the advice you'd give? Well, maybe not forever, but at least for a while.
So I think one of the important things on the electoral campaigns is make sure that there's discipline in what they point to as being real. So making sure that the level of scrutiny the candidates have along with their campaigns is at the highest level. We need to make sure that the candidates themselves are either having their own teams of technical experts or working with a trusted advisor that can look at material before they post it. So if a video pops up of their opponent saying or doing XYZ, like before they tweet it or post it, like just taking a step back and saying, did that really happen? Do we have the confidence? I think for 2020, there will be the beginnings of the platform providers integrating detection technology, but I think the best defense is going to be education. I think just asking the question, did that really happen, and why do I believe that it really happened, and looking at the source as much as the content is the most critical thing that really the American population needs to do for the upcoming election.
Matt?
Yeah, so great and I think hard question. I guess I'm going to keep my comments sort of focused on the technical piece, which is where I feel comfortable. I think there's a bunch of policy questions and social questions there as well, but I'm not well positioned to answer those. So what I will say is, I think through investments like the media forensics program, things that other companies are starting to do, there's now a community of technical experts that you can actually go to that have the capabilities to assess media and to be able to understand whether something was manipulated or not. That used to be a very niche, very small field. It has grown significantly over the last several years. So I guess if I had general advice, it's to recognize that there are resources out there and perhaps to seek those out proactively.
Great, that's really good advice. Jeanette, I was really struck by your phrase at the beginning about resilient public. So what would you tell them? What would you tell voters? What would you tell campaigns?
Yes, well, it is know your source is sort of our number one message, and then sort of kind of a corollary to that is know where your trusted sources are. So know where you need to actually, which website you should check for where you should vote. Know that you can get a provisional ballot if something happens when your name is not on the voter registration, those sorts of things. But like knowing your source is probably the one thing that we want. And I think both gave really good advice on the campaign side. There's some other sort of more just kind of traditional cybersecurity sorts of advice that we're giving them. And in addition, on the more the cybersecurity side and less on the disinformation, it's also recognizing that whether you're currently an elected official or even just a senior government official, if you're in that sort of high profile position or you're running it, know that your personal sort of accounts and your personal relationships can also be targets, and so make sure that you're doing what you can to secure or detect any activity related to that as well. I guess other than that, I would sort of just reinforce what was really already said.
Oh, great. Well, there's good advice for you as we move into what's going to be an exciting year in the information space.